I want to introduce Mr. Dan Press. Dan is going to talk about the objectives of the conference and ceremony. And Dan is the founder of the Roundtable on Native American Trauma-Informed Initiatives. And Dan is also, he came to Navajo Nation when he was 26 years old. He worked as an attorney over here at the DNA Legal Services, and he lived on Red Lake Road in Fort Defiance. And he rented a hogan right down the road from where we lived. No electricity, no indoor plumbing. He lived like a real Navajo. And he had a horse called Big John, and we in Fort Defiance, there's not one bill of gun in the whole area where we live on the Indian side of town. But we seen this guy riding a horse walking by right in front of our front yard wearing cowboy boots and jeans, and we said, "Who's that guy?" Here it was Dan. And then Dan he's actually formally part of my family. My dad adopted him many years ago. So he's my big brother in a way. So if you hear me insulting him and teasing him, I have that right to do it. The ceremony allows me to do it. So Dan is a renowned attorney, and in my estimation, he's the greatest Native American attorney in the United States. No ifs, ands, or buts. And I asked him to go over the objectives of the conference. And as we go along, there's small logistical things that people are reminding of me. So as we go forward, we'll talk about more logistics. But I want to introduce Mr. Dan Press.
Thank you. I first met Ken when he was a bratty teenager, and he still lies through his teeth when he was telling you about. But as Ken indicated, 50 years ago, it's hard to believe that long ago, I was working down the road for DNA, the Navajo Legal Services Program. And I left in 1972 to move to Washington, and I've been there ever since as a partner in a law firm, and I've spent my career representing tribes. But I got back here 3-4 times a year because I was fortunate to have two wonderful families take me in. The first was the White family you heard about, and the second, the Denitsoni Newman family. Betsy Denitsoni Newman, 91 years young, is sitting right there, and I'm so honored to have you here. And I came back to visit them, but I also came back because Betsy has a ranch tucked into the Cheska Mountains, and when I ever needed to escape Washington, I'd go out there, jump on a horse, and disappear into the Cheska Mountains. It was my therapy for my trauma of living in Washington. And over the 50 years, because I would come back regularly, I would see the tremendous progress that was being made here on the Navajo Reservation and other reservations as well. And just one example, when I was out here, there was one Navajo physician. You may remember Taylor McKenzie, one Navajo physician. Today, they're in the hundreds. And we're actually going to benefit from that. Tomorrow, you're going to get to hear an extraordinary young Navajo pediatrician, Marla Yazzie, talking about the work she's doing to bring trauma-informed programs to Navajo country. Marla's been an invaluable part of our planning team, and I think she's going to be the future leader of the trauma-informed programs. Marla, are you here? Stand up, and there she is. Thank you. So there was tremendous progress, but in certain areas, there wasn't progress. Areas that I always thought when I was here 50 years ago, problems that would disappear over time. And still 50 years later, the youth suicide rate is 10 times the national average. The high school dropout rate is the highest of any ethnic group in the country. The alcoholism rate is the highest of any group in the country. The drug problems have actually gotten worse since I was here. The gang problems have gotten worse. And over the years, I kept trying to figure out why haven't those problems, if not disappear, at least gotten better with time, with more people going to college, more jobs being created. And I couldn't come up with an answer. It was a great puzzle. And then Dr. Dakota introduced me to the trauma science. The ACE study that Tammy mentioned briefly asked a bunch of middle-class white people in San Diego about abuse they suffered as a child. And these are the areas of abuse they asked about. And to their surprise, they found two things. One is that even in a white middle-class community, many people suffered many of these. Below the surface of what looked like a very calm, rational, well-behaved community, there was a lot of trauma going on. And the second thing was the correlation they found between suffering these as a young child and if you suffered 4 or more ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, the things we just saw on the previous screen, you were much more likely to suffer alcoholism, drug abuse, suicide, diabetes, cancer, and other diseases, and live 20 years shorter, average 20. And I looked at that and I said, that's not San Diego. That's Native American country. Native American communities lead the country in every one of those things. And after the ACE study was done, the neuroscientists came, and Tammy gave you a real scientific description, but basically what they found is when you suffer those kinds of ACEs as a child, your body is pumping stress hormones into your system for the rest of your life. So what do you do when you're under a lot of stress, day in, day out? You try and relieve it. You drink, you take drugs, you overeat, you beat up your spouse, you blow up at your teacher so you don't complete school. And in the worst case, you commit suicide. So the neuroscientists and the ACE study came together to say that early childhood trauma is the best explanation that we came up with for all of these problems that plague Indian country. You've heard about Dr. Pico, one of the great Native American leaders. He was chairman of his tribe for 26 years. Imagine Navajo having the same tribal chairman for 26 years. But when he gives a speech, he begins by saying, imagine your community where there is, without alcohol and drug abuse, without suicide, where every student graduates from high school, where we can gain full employment, where there's a cultural awakening. And he goes on to say that this was the society you had 500 years ago. And the whole overriding objective of the conference is to help your community achieve that goal. And as we'll get into, it's not going to be fast. You can't overcome 500 years of being subjected to all the things that Tammy has described. But because we now know the cause of the problems that were on the screen before, the alcoholism, the drug abuse, we now have a path to a solution. In my 50 years, it's the first scientifically validated strategy for dealing with that host of problems that have plagued Native American communities. And it's the pathway to achieving the kind of community that every one of you would love to see in your community. So the first objective of this conference is to inform you about how you implement trauma-informed programs. And fortunately, there's been a lot of work done, mainly in non-Indian communities, but also in Indian communities, about how you start working towards that vision that Dr. Pico laid out. And there are a lot of ways to cut it, but this is 5 major areas in which you need to work to overcome the effects of trauma. First, you need to prevent it. Secondly, you need to train pediatricians to identify trauma early when the brain is still malleable, and put in place behavioral health programs with both the kid and the parent to help them overcome the early effects of trauma and help them avoid trauma in the future, to achieve the kind of attachment relationship that Dr. Dakota talked about. Third element is teaching resilience techniques. Those are coping techniques that allow people who've been traumatized but who haven't let the trauma control their life yet, learn how to, when they start feeling that stress rising up in their body, it's techniques they can use to help that stress go down and keep it from driving them to the dysfunctional behavior of drinking or drugs or beating somebody up. And we'll get into what those are, but Tammy named some of them: drumming, ceremonies, yoga, mindfulness, meditation. There are techniques, and they were particularly effective in schools, where you catch young people before the trauma's taken over their life and teach them ways of coping with the trauma so it never takes over their life. And then the last, the fourth area is for people whose trauma has already taken over their lives. Those are people who are on drugs, people who alcoholism has got them out on the streets of Gallup. And there are lots of programs out there for addressing alcoholism, addressing drugs. They haven't been all that effective. And what we now know from trauma science is because the drugs and the alcohol are symptoms. Till you treat the underlying trauma, you're not going to help those people cure their problem. So there are now treatment methods being developed that are trauma-informed, in the sense that they've been designed to deal with the underlying trauma. And the final piece that we've talked about is using healing, traditional healing practices, a critical piece, the whole warrior spirit piece that Ken White and Tammy talked about. So these are the 5 elements of a trauma-informed program. The second objective of the conference is to provide you information on how to implement programs in each of these areas. Over the next 2 days, start with the first one. Tomorrow you're going to hear a presentation by Marissa Begay talking about something called the Family Spirit Program, where they have Johns Hopkins has this intensive training program for older Native American women, the grandmas really, to train them to be mentors to young couples, really before conception, but to stay with them for the first 3 years and promote the kind of detachment relationships that Tammy talked about, to promote good parentage. Secondly, tomorrow you're going to hear a panel of IHS pediatricians who are being trained by a different Johns Hopkins program to be trauma-informed, and that they will be, I'm sorry, they will be able to identify in their patients, because almost every young kid sees a pediatrician, identify signs of trauma, and then in a partnership with the behavioral health program, help that kid and his parent overcome the trauma they already suffered and help them prevent trauma from going forward. And that's Marla Begay and her team from Gallup and Shiprock and Chin Lee. The third, teaching coping resilience. This afternoon, Dr. Joe Martin will be leading an afternoon discussion on school programs that have been implemented to teach resilience techniques, to teach coping techniques, to use trauma-informed approaches to reduce the high school dropout rate. And I'll get into a second. We've got proof it works. It really requires a complete change in the atmosphere in the school. The fourth category, providing intensive therapy. We're going to have two speakers. One, Juanita Williams, is working to use trauma-informed approaches to deal with opioid addiction. And she's going to be talking about how they deal with that. The standard programs for dealing with opioid addiction have not had a very high success rate. Again, because opioid use is just another way of dealing with your trauma, so you've got to deal with the underlying trauma. And the second presenter is Andrea Clifford from the Northern Arapaho tribe, who will describe this incredible program they instituted in their casino, where they were having a very high turnover rate among tribal members. And the whole purpose of the casino was to create employment. And they instituted a trauma-informed behavioral health program. They hired 7 behavioral health counselors, and they told somebody who was going to be fired because of drug use, because of not showing up Monday morning, all the other problems, rather than being fired, we're going to put you on leave of absence. And if you agree to participate in our behavioral health program and you complete it, we'll put you back on the job. And they not only use those behavioral health counselors, they use equine-assisted psychotherapy, they use sweat lodges, they use all of the traditional approaches that Tammy talked about. And 67% of the employees who went through that system and were about to be fired are now back on the job and are successful employees. And the benefit to the casino is enormous. They don't have to go out and advertise for new employees, train new employees. So the cost of providing this program is paid back multiple times. And finally, what we've talked about all morning is any trauma-informed program needs to include traditional healing practices. And we're going to be fortunate to have several traditional healers talking about their use of traditional practices. One of them is somebody who helped me, the White family put on a ceremony for me before I had cranial surgery. And he told me everything would go right, and I'm here. So I'm really honored to have him here. So, so these are the areas you're going to learn about that will help you in your institution, whether it's the school system or the healthcare system or the court system, social work, to help you implement trauma-informed programs. But that's not enough. What we've learned is that no one institution can implement and successfully implement a trauma-informed program. The trauma is so pervasive that if the school system tries it by itself, the trauma elsewhere in the community will overwhelm it, if the healthcare system tries it by itself. And what is needed is what we call a comprehensive, integrated, trauma-informed initiative, where every institution in the community is implementing trauma-informed programs and doing so in a coordinated manner. And fortunately, we have a great example of that. The Menominee tribe of Wisconsin, there were 2 brothers. One headed the school system and the other headed the health clinic. And they discovered the ACE study in trauma, and they started building a comprehensive trauma-informed program on the reservation. I was out there a couple of years ago. It's amazing. They have meetings quarterly where every program on the reservation is sitting around the table, and they're talking about how they're coordinating their efforts to address teenage drinking, to address drug use, to address teen pregnancy. And what they've really done is they've restored the traditional way tribes operated. They're working together, working with self-respect. And these are just 2, it's only been a few years, but they've already produced some really, I think, dramatic statistics. The high school dropout rate went from 40% to 5%. The teenage pregnancy rate declined from over 20 a year to 5 a year. And the way they did that goes back to the use of traditional practices. They had the traditional healers come into the schools and talk to the teenage girls about how the tribe historically viewed pregnancy as something sacred, something that came from the Creator, and that it's not something you just decide to do after a night of drinking. And the effect is what you see here. So it's an example of how traditional practices, the school system did it by teaching meditation. Students come into class every morning. They spend the first 15 minutes meditating. They train their teachers that when a kid acts out, as Dr. Dakota described, his fight or flight mechanism is just going full beat. That's not a time to talk to him. So they created quiet rooms, and they send the kid to a quiet room, give him a chance for his adrenaline to come down, and then they have a behavioral health counselor right in the school who goes in and works with the kid.